The People's Fort would like to welcome H.D. Franklin L.
Good morning.
Mr. Franklin joins us today to dialogue a statement that he has prepared.
That is correct.
This presentation of the People's Fort is brought to you by Five Star Proud and the H.D. Franklin L. Foundation. The opinions expressed within this content are solely of the authors and do not reflect the opinions and beliefs of our sponsors.
The marketed genocide of black people is the entitlement of this segment. Throughout history, mankind and those such as Clarence Thomas, Isaac Franklin, Jesse Jackson, John Armfield, Errol Sharpton, and Tipu Tip, not to be confused with the rapper Tip, have and yet are perpetuating the ideologies of the Lebensborn Center.
And what exactly is the Lebensborn Center?
The Lebensborn Center was basically a large college campus constructed with dormitories, lecture halls. The lecture halls were to perpetuate the curriculum taught there in the school. It was only one curriculum, and in the Lebensborn Center, it was there for the perpetuating of blonde-haired, blue-eyed children and Nazi supremacy. The like serve as catalysts of subliminal programming, a type of hypnotherapy and its conditioning to produce a designed result in action and or omissions from the person or the people that are subjected to that particular session. The Hypnotherapy Training College Australia revealed that 93 out of 100 people subjected to hypnotherapy for at least 6 sessions were successfully programmed to do as they were instructed. Meaning this, if you are fed the same suggestions over and over for a minimum of 6 sessions, that you would be victimized by whatever you were programmed to do and or say. If your mother was directed to murder your father, there is a very high likelihood that your mother would in fact murder your father. That is the direct impact of hypnotherapy. If your wife or child were directed to indiscriminately have sex with random strangers, or for that part, directed to have sex with barnyard animals, they would, of course, perform as they were directed.
What kind of tasks did the Australian researchers ask these individuals to do?
In the college, the professors, the therapists were directed to mimic the CIA's use of LSD in performing minimum tasks such as the Manchurian Candidate. They were doing from tasks such as simple as touching your nose with any particular index finger as you were directed, or from sitting and standing repeatedly as you were directed, but basically on cue. The Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings of 1991, wherein Miss Anita Hill cemented the mental sterilization of Clarence Thomas in the minds of generations to come, has now brought her words to everyone's fruition. Now, people, we see just what she was seeing all along. And now our eyes are filled with not only the tears of her words, but also the bloody sacrifices of our ancestors for us to simply have the right not to be bothered.
Now, what exactly was it Miss Anita Hill had to say?
Clarence Thomas was sexually harassing her, trying to pressure her into having sex with him, some type of sex act with him, in order to not only secure some type of advancement, but to guarantee the job that she had. He was more famous for making comments to her about pubic hairs being in a Coke that she was drinking. In her presence, he made this type of comment. Clarence Thomas is not merely trying to rewrite history. Clarence Thomas is trying to reduce humanity to being a subculture and take away all the rights gained by common sense, as well as all the rights fought for through civic activism. The stretched necks and the spilled blood of our ancestors should be the flag that Clarence Thomas champions. But instead, the voice of Clarence Thomas is sinning with the emissions of his slave master's lower extremities and the denials of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He must think that he himself would not be a slave on a plantation, or maybe even a boudoir companion of RuPaul Andre Charles. Clarence Thomas clearly thinks that although the majority of his accomplishments were and are made possible by the very rights, immunities, and privileges that so many have given life and limb for us to have the benefit of, that he himself would still and otherwise be where he is right now. This waste of animated flesh, aka Clarence Thomas, must somehow believe that without the substantive due process clause in the 14th Amendment in the United States Constitution, that he would otherwise be legally able to keep his Caucasian wife. You should also keep in mind that the assassinations of the likes of Michael Jackson, Rosa Parks, Nat Turner, Shirley Chisholm, Rodney King, Mary Church Terrell, Captain Roman Duckworth Jr., Harriet Tubman, Reverend Bruce Clunder, Viola Gregg Liuzzo, Ben Chester White, Asanta Shakur, aka Joanne Deborah Byron, Matthew McFarland, Sasha Ivana Bell, Jose Williams, Shakur Renee Reed, Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Sojourner Truth, Jimmy Lee Jackson, and Ida B. Wells, and of course, Prince, aka the artist formerly known as The Symbol, are but some of the people who actually suffered the physical torture and ultimate mortal demise to make sure that black people, including Clarence Thomas, could have a seat as the United States Supreme Court Justice, or at least an Associate Justice. On June 24, 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court issued the following statement in which Clarence Thomas wrote an opinion. That quote is here. As I have previously explained, substantive due process is an oxymoron that lacks any basis in the Constitution, he wrote. He later called it a legal fiction that is particularly dangerous. Substantive due process is a term in constitutional law that essentially allows the courts to protect certain rights, even if those rights are not explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. It has been interpreted in many cases to apply to matters relating to the right to privacy, including over matters like love, intimacy, and sex, which is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. In future cases, we should reconsider all of this court's substantive due process precedents, including Griswold, Lawrence, and Oberfeld, because any substantive due process decision is demonstrably erroneous. We have a duty to correct the error established in the precedents, Thomas wrote. And because the court, in its ruling Friday, drew heavily upon that very idea, the substantive due process is not in the Constitution, Thomas concluded that almost all precedents that relied upon that doctrine, and because the court, in its ruling Friday, drew heavily on that very idea, that substantive due process is not in the Constitution, Thomas concluded that almost all other precedents that relied upon that doctrine should also be overturned. I join in the opinion of the court because it correctly holds that there is no constitutional right to abortion. Respondents invoke one source for that right. The 14th Amendment's guarantee that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The court well explained why, under our substantive due process precedents, the purported right to abortions is not a form of liberty protected by the Due Process Clause. Such a right is neither deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition, nor implicit in the concept of ordered liberty, he wrote. Keep also in mind that because Clarence Thomas does, as most slaves do, orally osculating the nates and sphincters of their Caucasian masters, Clarence Thomas was rewarded by his Caucasian slave masters. for Clarence Thomas supporting his slave master's directions and taking a public stand against democracy, taking a stand against substantive due process, and in support of tyranny. The case that gave Clarence Thomas the right to marry his Caucasian wife was stated as being a case that will not now be under review by the U.S. Supreme Court, thus granting Clarence Thomas temporary permission to keep his Caucasian wife. In Friday,
So essentially, you're saying that Clarence Thomas is a puppet.
yes, a mindless puppet, yes. In Friday's opinion, Thomas made no mention of Loving versus West Virginia, the landmark 1967 ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court that struck down laws prohibiting interracial marriages. That decision relied in part on the substantive due process doctrine and was cited in several subsequent decisions that did as well, and that is to include Obergefell in 2015. Follow the sequences. The Dred Scott ruling by the United States Supreme Court has never been overturned. Black people are still cattle in the eyes of Caucasian law. Slavery is rejuvenated. Black people are forced to either take up arms in our defense or flee the country. If we industriously stay in this country, we then are forced to labor for pennies a day, and interracial children will suffer the same persecutions as did the black people during the Holocaust and slavery. You've already accepted being named African Americans, so why not?
What is it that you find negative about being titled African American?
I do not need somebody else to tell me who and what I am, especially somebody who has no idea who they are. Loving is a very important decision by the United States Supreme Court because it specifically addresses the marriage between Clarence Thomas and his Caucasian wife and all other interracial marriages that would have been deemed illegal in certain states effective right then, had the court not ruled the way it did in Loving. Thus, Clarence Thomas did not mention the 1967 decision as one that should be revisited. In their own opinion, Justice Samuel Alito and Brett Kavanaugh, Thomas's slave masters, both referred to Loving, writing that it should not be revisited despite its reliance upon substantive due process, thus again allowing Clarence Thomas to keep his Caucasian wife. President Joe Biden, speaking to the nation following the ruling Friday, specifically addressed Thomas's analysts, saying it paves an extreme and dangerous path that the court is now taking us on. People, you must keep in mind that a presidential executive order is not legally beyond the challenge of the United States Supreme Court. Therefore, the bill signed by President Joe Biden, as reported on December 13, 2022, in reality is a diversion, a stall tactic, because Clarence Thomas has a seat on the United States Supreme Court. People, history reveals that once the slave master has no further use for any particular slave, the slave master takes immediate and decisive action against that particular slave or slaves. I guess now the question is, why are the Caucasian slave masters of Clarence Thomas taking so long? Oh yeah, they're not finished using him yet. Instead of this vile Clarence Thomas doing his little ass, keeping the doors open that he himself came through, this mentally impotent septic tank of a person has been doing everything in his power to close them very same doors. When this toxic bedpan of a person known as Clarence Thomas was sperm in his dad's testicles, his dad should have discharged the sperm of Clarence Thomas into a sock and thrown it into the logs of a roaring campfire. Those like this Supreme Court Associate Justice Clarence Thomas has to pragmatically be the poster child for why abortions must remain legal. They have to. Since birth, I have been spoon-fed the regurgitated rhetoric of a history that actually has absolutely nothing in truth to do with me, nor my history, nor the history of any other black person. The public academic curriculum and formulas has always been to hypnotize me into believing that you do not exist. Yet, You are all that I have learned about in public schools. There are no scholastic curriculums of black history other than the dehumanizing antics of those oppressed blacks in slavery. You can keep your references of traditionally black colleges to yourself, as I am not of the opinion that they are staples of black learning because neither of them has a black curriculum of black history. With that in mind, I will now address a couple of these so-called traditionally black colleges. First, there's Spelman College, University. Spelman was named in 1884 after a Caucasian who carried the name of Rockefeller, specifically Lucy Henry Spelman Rockefeller. It's as though no one has traced the history of the Rockefellers back to the origin of the first Rockefeller that appeared in New York. There are FBI files which explain that history erred in its portrayal of Jesse and Frank James, although I personally believe that it was Frank James and not Jesse James that was murdered on April 3rd, 1882. There are some FBI files on Jesse James that explain that it was neither Jesse James nor Frank James that was shot in the head on April 3rd, 1882. FBI files further indicate that Jesse James took the name Rockefeller from a man that Jesse James allegedly murdered, a man that by today's standard would be somewhere in the financial middle class of society, but whose family was already in the oil business. The name Rockefeller is therefore simply a mask to hide the true identity of the notorious Jesse James. Their legacy is historic and riddled with bank robberies and murders. There are also reports that contradict that and say that it was Jesse James that was shot in the head and killed, but the dates of the murder contradict themselves, but go on to explain that Jesse James was murdered, but his brother, Frank James, found his way into a new and strange territory and immediately changed his name. Frank James changed his surname to Rockefeller, and with the stolen money and other stolen proceeds began the Rockefeller legacy, after murdering a man by the name of Rockefeller. Now, on the subject of the Rockefellers, I must also point out that the Rockefellers were masterful in painting a picture in society most reflective of prominency. But then there was Michael Rockefeller. Michael Rockefeller dug in hard to the public image of the Rockefellers when he, Michael Rockefeller, publicly announced that not only is he gay, but that he will not be kept in a closet like some disregarded garment of clothing. Michael Rockefeller yelled to the world that he sexually prefers men as opposed to females. Thus, the phrase of, "I am here, I am gay, now hear me roar," horrified the Rockefellers. Michael Rockefeller would not be silenced and further catered to numerous sexual affairs with publicly well-known men. The Rockefellers were horrified and felt that Michael Rockefeller tarnished the Rockefeller image simply by being gay. Thus, to rid the world of the tarnished image upon the Rockefeller brand, Nelson Rockefeller decreed that Michael Rockefeller had to be gotten rid of immediately. Michael Rockefeller suddenly disappeared from the public eye without a trace. And already knowing that Michael Rockefeller would not ever be seen again, the Rockefeller camp released a statement to the public on the 19th of November in the year of 1961, to the effect being that Michael Clark Rockefeller had been captured and eaten by cannibals. Michael Rockefeller, known to Nelson Rockefeller as the tarnish on the Rockefeller image, was suddenly gone from the public Rockefeller legacy. Now, concerning Howard University as the next most known traditionally black college university, in short, Howard College University is named after a mass murderer whose name is Major General Oliver Otis Howard. I'm sure that the Native Americans are really proud of Major General Oliver Otis Howard, especially since Major General Oliver Otis Howard led numerous raids against Native Americans. Major General Oliver Otis Howard slaughtered as many Native Americans as he and his command had ammunition to shoot, knives and bayonets to stab, and ropes to hang, just so you know. Black people as a whole were not then well versed in the spoken foreign language of Caucasians, but were repeatedly spoon fed the propaganda of Charles Darwin, yet another Caucasian trying to tell me what I am and who I am. That of which I have continuously questioned. To the point, if black people were derived from monkeys, why are monkeys still not waking up as black people right now? The answer is really simple. Black people have never been monkeys, but such is the curriculum of every school in America today. The statement of every school today does in fact include the proverbial, historically, black colleges and universities. Black people are paying thousands of dollars in college tuitions and student loans to learn about everybody's history except our own black history. If you were to consider the DNA of black people, you will see as well that most black people that do graduate with honors. Further counterproductive is the fact that if any of the same black people that graduated with honors are fortunate enough to gain employment after college, student loan bills, and having to take a job that's $10 to $20 below their celebrated prestigious college degree, still lands these same black people that graduated from colleges and universities with degrees straight back into their parents' basement. As is in most cases, there has not been anything known to have been left by our elders that reflect generational wealth in this capitalistic society. My point is this: black people are paying Caucasians for Caucasians to hide black history from black people, while Caucasians teach black people the fantasy of Caucasian history. And even then, once black people do suspend their own independence of truth and master the Caucasian fantasy of Caucasian history, Caucasians still do not hire black people. Deny, if you will, the major contributors of black people in all societies of the world, past, present, and future, have been and yet are raising the academic bar to celestial chapters, mastering quintessential alchemy, and revealing to the general public the heirs of a misplaced legacy. Deny the facts that without the roller coaster within amusement parks, you would still enjoy the carnivals, fairs, Disneyland, and Disney World as much as you have, if not for the roller coaster. This is something else that was created by a black man, and that black man is Granville T. Woods. Deny the fact that without air brakes on our buses, be the buses school buses or public transportation buses, the importance of air brakes is forever essential. Without air brakes on our planes, tanks, and our largest diesel vehicles, if you think you would otherwise be as happy or even half as efficient in performing your daily duties without air brakes, you are not being honest with yourself. Nevertheless, this is something else that was created by a black man, and that black man is again Granville T. Woods. Granville T. Woods invented many more items for the necessities in life that academic institutions restrict from their curriculum of public awareness. Caucasians prohibit these types of achievements from becoming a matter of general awareness because if black people ever realize that Caucasian society depends upon black people, Caucasians will set themselves back more than they care to admit. Caucasians are literally praying for black people to remain at least as much of a mental slave as that sellout Clarence Thomas is. Further, Caucasians do so because Caucasians know that those that are at least a mirrored image or reflection of the likes of Clarence Thomas, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and Tipu Tip, again, not to be confused with the rapper Tip, truly stand for nothing. Therefore, they will fall for anything and everything. The masses have been literally spoon-fed an agenda of self-destruction. The theory of evolution is to divert attention from just who has a history of morphing from animals, and of course, the assistance of the man affectionately known as being the big-head scientist. The illusion theory, aka theory of evolution, the origin of the species, should be enough of an example to teach people that racism thinks that everybody in the world is stupid except racism. Through some of the following literary works, we come face to face with yet various other cases of hypnotherapy in action against black people by the Le Bon Center. The hateful prejudices and racisms of the Lebensborn Center, regurgitated through the likes of David Duke, Albert Pike, as well as the Third Reich, and such is echoed in the rhetoric of the Book of Trickology, racial conversion, demonization, placeable empowerment, lie manipulation, evil embodiment, demorphizology, mass manipulation, intelligence infinitum, intelligence reduction, enhanced intelligence, scientific prowess, and corrupt inducement. Channeling through the above publications, you will find strong similarities to the Willie Lynch letters, as well as the ideas in the works entitled The Making of a Slave. People, we have been deceived, and even now, we are standing before the altar of time, witnessing our true history be erased from the knowledge of generations to come. It's as though some black people are lummoxing through this world in the shadow of the soulless, heads buried up the rectums of mankind while being deprived of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We are being murdered, and our women are being raped. Hypnotized black people, this is your call to order. Hypnotized long before the Apostle Peter fell off of his horse, hitting his head. Delirious from the blow to his head, the Apostle Peter was enslaved by illusions of grandeur in the absence of Jesus the Christ. Hence, the first Catholic Church building began. Thurgood Marshall, former United States Supreme Court Associate Justice, did absolutely nothing to overturn the decision of Dred Scott versus John F. A. Stanford, cited as 60 United States, page 393, the year 1856. However, Thurgood Marshall remains a role model to a good many people, and yet Thurgood Marshall did absolutely nothing to stop the Vatican from trading the birth records of black people on the New York stock market every single workday. Thurgood Marshall did nothing to reverse the legal standings of a black man is not a man and less than a Caucasian. So please keep your praise of Thurgood Marshall to yourself, because the record speaks for itself as to what Thurgood Marshall really was, as well as to whom Thurgood Marshall was really employed by.
This presentation of the People's Fort is brought to you by 5-Star Proud and the H.D. Franklin L. Foundation. The opinions expressed within this content are solely of the authors and do not reflect the opinions and beliefs of our sponsors.
Now, of Samantha Giersback, a notary public within the state of Michigan and an employee of the Forefront Credit Union. Mind you now that Samantha is not only bonded in the state of Michigan to perform judicially binding functions as a bonded notary public, thus invested with a greater level of trust than may be extended on site to the average stranger. Judicially armed to be a component of justice and to pragmatically stand against fraud and corruption. Also, Samantha is charged with the handling of various amounts of cash for Forefront Credit Union and charged with the duties of handling the cash of other people throughout Michigan, if not the world. On numerous occasions, I have stood in the audience of Samantha and directly observed Samantha while in the Forefront Credit Union, clearly and with the forethought to do so, fabricate the count of mass amounts of money that obviously does not belong to Samantha. In one instance, Samantha claimed to have personally verified the presence of at least $160 less than was actually placed into the cash ATM. I found myself immersed within the circumstances of these frauds and essential robberies committed by Samantha because I am a black man whom Samantha, a Caucasian, actually defrauded and robbed of $160. After allowing Samantha a more than fair opportunity to correct the criminal and plainly racially motivated behavior and return the funds, but instead Samantha doubled down and stood by her criminal and racially motivated activity. I immediately sought the attention of the bank's supervisor, Megan. She explained that Forefront Credit Union does not have a grievance process, but that she, Megan, the supervisor, would talk to Samantha about it. On December 7th, 2022, I learned that as a punishment for the defraud and robbery charges that I leveled against Samantha, Samantha has been transferred. And get this, Samantha has been promoted. I am obviously researching other financial institutions in order to relocate my funds post haste. I am not allowing myself to get caught in the wonder of just how many other black people Samantha has defrauded and robbed while employed by the Forefront Credit Union. After all, Megan, the supervisor of the Petoskey Forefront Credit Union, will probably conceal and reward Samantha with yet another promotion for her organized criminal behavior. Maybe they split the proceeds of each robbery with each other. Or perhaps it's the policy of Forefront Credit Union to rob black people of their hard-earned money in the general scheme of things, to keep black people in as great of a condition of destitution as is possible. It's clear that racism against black people is the central theme of not just the United States in general, but the fluidity of this hate crime is further personified by the administrators of big business. Predators of hate crime from within the administrative offices of big business maintain racist postures in effort to stifle the credibility of black people. These Nazi criminals surround themselves with empty-headed characters that resemble themselves in appearance. The Nazi administrators build up the United States disposition against black people. These Nazi administrators, without hesitation, heir to Jim Crow and such rhetoric in action as of the Lebensborn Center. These Nazi administrators fail to ensure the completion of necessary on-the-job training, thus rendering black people vulnerable to misplaced and adverse labels of incompetency, perhaps stemming from misinformation. These Nazi administrators drum hypnotherapy and rewards those employees of like appearance that act in concert with the oppression of black people. These Nazi administrators are fast to penalize anybody that stands as guard for fairness, where the blanket of fairness does not displace black people. In being even more direct, these particular Nazi administrators of such subsidiaries as the Magna International Corporation, and in Pacific, these particular Nazi administrators are in the Lexmark Corporation within Boyne City, Michigan. These situations, the Forefront Credit Union robbery by Samantha, and the actions and omissions of these particular Nazi administrators of the Lexmark Corporation in Boyne City, Michigan, a subsidiary of the Magna International Corporation, are in fact details of hate crimes. With that said, I will now move on to racist landlords, such as Mike Caducci and a circuit court judge by the name of Julie O'Neill, and both are within the city and state of Eaton Rapids, Michigan. There are racist circuit court judges strategically appointed, such as one, Julie O'Neill, but this is not to exclude the rest of the racist judicial judges that the former United States President Donald Trump assigned to the legal system, that constantly tailor the language of established law from the bench to maintain the programming of Jim Crow, Hitler, the Third Reich, and the Lebensborn Center. The law is literally being rewritten in action by and in part made clear within the Dred Scott decision. You, Charlie Siska, you, Brennan Merriam, you, Sheila Bellant, and you, Corey Frost, are staples of constitutional violations and the ostracizing of black people. You, Charlie Siska, you, Brennan Merriam, you, Sheila Bellant, and you, Corey Frost, are as destructive to a human society of morality, culture, and individual thought as AT&T's 1993 depiction of black people being monkeys, and as you are representatives of the Magna International Corporation, I sincerely hope that black people everywhere become immediately aware of your hatred of black people from an organized platform. The statement to me by Corey Frost explaining that the standards were lowered in order to employ me, a black man at the Lexmark Corporation in Boyne City, Michigan, the subsidiary of the Magna International Corporation, was quite inspiring, can't you see? Since you each have declared it, please know that I sincerely accept. This is reminiscent of David Duke's 1988 presidential hopes and the fact that perhaps the largest amounts of Duke's campaign funds were generated in and by the Nazis in northern Michigan. Your attention is now humbly directed to some events that occurred on December 2nd, 2022, within a small claims court that was presided over by Judge Julie O'Neill, number P64544. Judge Julie O'Neill took it up on herself in concert with racism to make me and my business her business. Judge Julie O'Neill rendered an opinion where I am concerned. Thus, I will elaborate on my opinion of Judge Julie O'Neill and the space that Judge Julie O'Neill, unfortunately, occupies. O'Neill occupies the space of a circuit court judge where, in respect to justice, O'Neill should not even be allowed to be in the same room. It is a legal conflict with equality as well as the United States Constitution for Judge Julie O'Neill to even practice law, as such nefarious alliances with racism is overwhelmingly sinister and counterproductive to black people. In an effort to hide the racist actions and biased rulings of Judge Julie O'Neill, O'Neill required all parties to sign a waiver prior to the commencement of all proceedings. That, in effect, was to ensure the waiving of all rights to appeal her decision. Definitely a red flag, but we went on with the proceedings. O'Neill further ruled that like actions of the defendant in this case has no place in law with her, where I, a black man, is concerned. This is contrary to Michigan Rules of Evidence, Rule 401, Rule 402, and Rule 404. Michigan Complied Laws 750.147B, Michigan Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, Equal Protection, 18 U.S.C. 241, 18 U.S.C. 249. The general gist of the case is a tenant-landlord dispute over the refusal to return the security deposit. Caducci, the racist landlord, and in my opinion, a racist slumlord, disputed being legally bound by MCL 554.609, MCL 554.610, and MCL 750.88, which is made applicable through Public Act 188 of 2020 and the Michigan Constitution of 1963, Article 1, Section 2, to return the security deposit of the tenant, even though this racist slumlord admitted on the record and in front of O'Neill to receiving but not returning this same security deposit, and that the rent was paid up in full. This racist slumlord Caducci has a history of being a slumlord, failing to appear at related proceedings, as well as refusals to comply with court orders. But when O'Neill was directly faced with judicial facts of this behavior, O'Neill simply refused to hear anything other than the hypnotherapy and the criminal mantra of a hate crime, by denying yet another black man the rights to equal protection and substantive due process. The expedited levels of racism against black people have never retracted its venomous fangs from the life of black people. But in fact, the individual episodes detailing actions and omissions of racism are facilitated by the Fibonacci sequence worldwide. In the case of Franklin versus Caducci, the plaintiff was awarded the security deposit back from Caducci, but O'Neill did nothing on the record as far as the return of the $50 filing fee, the fees to have the proceedings served on the defendant, nor the fees incurred in the maintenance of the civil action. O'Neill simply made excuses for the defendant's refusal to return the security deposit. O'Neill did nothing to return the funds rendered for the gas to travel nearly 4 hours both ways in a Tahoe, one of the largest SUVs made behind the Suburban and the Hummer. There was no return of the gas funds totaling over $200. Considering the wear and tear on the automobile, time off from work, copying fees, and research fees were not even addressed by O'Neill. For the record, I must point out that Caducci, as well as applying the lowercase j in the judge for O'Neill, are Caucasians and Franklin is a black man. These actions and omissions of racism are always right in front of us, and it's from the homeless to the highest level of our government. I wonder if Judge O'Neill campaign records reflect donations from the supporters of David Duke or other white supremacist organizations. With conviction, I am of the opinion that O'Neill is simply the discharge of an accident or maybe a failed abortion. Possibly the manifestation of just why lab experiments should be closer monitored by the public at large. These actions detailed herein of O'Neill in this matter are, of course, instances of hate crimes. The actions herein detailed of O'Neill in this matter are, of course, instances of a hate crime. Hate crime by an organized system is defined by the RICO Act. The RICO Act is defined as being Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organization Act. From the perspective of that law and act, when you view the judicial system as a whole and the corruption of O'Neill, you will clearly find that the most ruthless and conspiratorial adverse actions committed against black people are carried out by law enforcement and supported by the judicial system. I wonder just how many black people O'Neill has ruled against despite the law being to the contrary. I think that it's time to audit O'Neill's tax records and travel vouchers to see just how long O'Neill has represented Caucasian supremacy from the judicial bench while under color of law. Maybe O'Neill herself has a Klan robe and a hood, aside from the black robe of the bench. This information is accessible under the Freedom of Information Act. These types of racist actions are more than enough just cause to probe the removal of this abomination from the judicial bench. But of course, most black people are too cowardly to undertake this war. But when it's your neck in the hangman's noose, you suddenly develop a voice, and then your cries for help are all that is heard. For sure, whenever I am faced with the prejudices and the rhetoric of hollow heads as these blasphemous creations, I endeavor to remind myself that I am at that very moment being discriminated against by the excrement of that which is to me lower than the slime of a common gastropod, and of course, I am your salt. Concerning Jesse Jackson Sr., whom I have even less respect for, people, I ask you, how do you think that every single hotel, motel room was able to not only have listening devices planted within them before the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived, but how do you think that they knew where the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would definitely be staying ahead of time? There was an inside informant, and my money is on Jesse Jackson as being that inside informant. The inside informant that essentially facilitated the demise of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. At a specific location, particular Caucasians decided that they wanted to again change the name of black people to African Americans. For decades have I noticed the name changes of black people from coon and spook to jigaboo, from colored to nigger, and from less than human to black, and from my true identity, from Kuta Kente to Henry. Those in attendance not only placed wagers on how long it would take before the masses here in the United States would adopt the name that they selected for black people here in America. Those in attendance were deliberately methodical in selecting people that had so much stacked against them that they could not refuse their instructions. They selected none other than Jesse Jackson Sr. on one end of the map, and on the other end of the map, they selected Al Sharpton to champion their racist amusement of, again, renaming black people. As to John Armfield, most of you all yet utilize the products that continue to enrich Caucasians and academically paralyze a great many black people today, just as Bob Barker, the former host of The Price is Right and value asset of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. Companies that change their names to become subsidiaries of other companies, of other businesses, of John Armfield, of Bob Barker and Isaac Franklin, sharing the spilled blood of young black women, virgins torn open by the repeated insertions of anything as well as everything into the orifices of their bodies. For those of you that dispute this, you can easily Google the Smithsonian Magazine where this subject is visited, which I may add is part of the reason why the names of companies had to be changed and new subsidiaries had to be born. People Fort Knox had been void of any of the gold that was there before the 41st Congress slammed down the gavel calling to order its semi-public session. In 1871, the United States Treasury was literally broke in every sense of the word, and as a result, the United States actually went bankrupt. The United States went bankrupt, and the powers that be claimed that the United States went broke because the enslaved black people were no longer the forced and cheap commodity of the Caucasians. Clearly, nothing can be accomplished without black people. Absent black people being victimized by slavery, the United States went to every major government that had directly benefited from black people being enslaved and sold shares of the United States to them. Remember, the birth certificate and social security numbers are sold every weekday morning on the New York stock market. Legally, black people are still not free. The 41st Congress sold shares of the United States and black people to the Lords of London after secret changes were made to the United States Constitution, which granted Congress the option to globally sell black people. World bankers jumped at the opportunity to own what black people built and are still building, hence the Act of 1871, and the United States of America was transformed into a corporation. The United States of America is not only a corporation, but in fact is a straightforward British Crown colony managed by NWO. Of course, in this century, there is a contract deal on the record between the Rothschilds, the Lords of London, the Rockefellers, and the Vatican. Thus, the Rockefellers share in ownership of blacks here in the U.S. Now, as to Al Sharpton. How often has the covert offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, guaranteed your employment and cleared the way for you to miraculously obtain the approval of the Federal Communications Commission? I remember the COINTEL program of the cross-dressing J. Edgar Hoover. Since some of you may not realize the role of the FCC in America, please allow me to sum it up by revealing to you the modern-day Lebensborn Center and the Order of Protective Custody from Nazi Germany of 1933, which prohibited race mixing everywhere. Most academic institutions only provide the public with the general gist of the Jews being persecuted by Hitler and Franz Muller. None of them will point out the fact that the Jewish Holocaust truly magnified the rape and murder of black people at the exact same time as the Jewish Holocaust, a subject that I have covered in earlier segments. By the way, the exact same office of the FBI that paid for the home and land of Timothy McVeigh after he was found guilty and sentenced for the Oklahoma bombing is the exact same office in the FBI that is to this very date issuing funding for Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. Why do you think that Al Sharpton was granted a plateau to chastise black people for questioning Barack Hussein Obama on why, Barack Hussein Obama was doing absolutely nothing for black people as a whole, nor individually. I am of the opinion that Obama actually did less for black people during his presidency than Jesse Jackson did in his campaign for the primary, as Jesse Jackson did not campaign for the U.S. presidency. However, Mr. Dick Gregory did in fact campaign for the United States presidency in 1968. Keep in mind that nearly all of Obama's academic transcripts are sealed for at least 50 to 75 years from the general public's review by the United States Supreme Court. Clarence Thomas continues to set black people back decades while he's sitting in the laps and on the digits of his male Caucasian slave masters. It would seem that there are no women willing to accept the fact that females gained the right to vote through the very same Civil Rights Act that Clarence Thomas is laboring to undo by having the language of substantive due process removed from the 14th Amendment in the United States Constitution. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution granted black people the right to vote, while simultaneously granting all women the right to vote by law, but not even today in practice. The only reason that females are allowed to vote today is by the movement rooted in the civil rights activism that was spurred by black people, and thereby giving conception and birth to the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. I am in fact a feminist, and I do support women's rights as well. Author Elaine Wise offered the following quote in support of white supremacy. You know there are more white women who will be willing to vote than black women. So don't worry, white supremacy is not going to be endangered, says Elaine Wise, author of The Woman's Hour. With respect to white supremacy, when you deem disrespect and contempt for the force of your maker, you make your life an open book. You desecrate your past with the cesspool of your presence to truly ensure that your future is filled with the stench of your true purpose, and you deliver to humanity the fact that you are no more than a simple parasite of an appendage that is occupying a space that should be restricted to the caves of distant mountains. In my absence, driving through the plushness of the green lawn of my yard is perhaps not very wise. This is private property, as I just may be there should you undertake such an endeavor again. But if so, perhaps you should first make good with your God. December 25th, 2022, AL. Merry Christmas.
This presentation of The People's Fort is brought to you by 5-Star Proud and the H.D. Franklin L. Foundation. The opinions expressed within this content are solely of the authors and do not reflect the opinions and beliefs of our sponsors.